Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Data Playbook. For the beginning of Week 7, we have Thursday Night Football with Pittsburgh at Cincinnati, so let's jump right into it. Before we get into our data, there's just a couple quick updates to cover. One of the things I did to start is I took away the player list that was here. It took up a bunch of space and wasn't overly useful, especially now because in the depth chart, I kind of have this going on. It should look a little better hopefully soon, but basically I can go through and click on these and then click on the actual player. So instead of actually having to search in a list, you can just bring up the player panels. Much easier that way in the depth chart based on what you want to see. The next big thing to notice is that I started moving the rankings around a little bit. I now have a scoring rank as well for how many points they scored, but I also want to put like some of the raw values up here so you can see more of a comparison of what they allowed, what they actually have, and that'll pull out some of these averages down here, and I can clean up these panels a little bit. Also, you have the fantasy ones here. I don't have the rankings. These are just the same numbers I placed in for now, but otherwise you have your fantasy totals for the team and then the averages that they have for the season so you can see which teams are really producing fantasy points in the end. Other than that, everything's about the same, so I'll just walk through it the way I have in the past. We'll start with the Steelers are favored on the money line with a spread of 5.5 and a total point line of 44.5. Looking at their rankings, you have a scoring rank of 14 and an allowed scoring rank of 17 for the Steelers, a passing rank of 25, an allowed passing rank of 31, and a rushing rank of 29 and an allowed rushing rank of 16. For the Bengals, you have a scoring rank of 29 and an allowed scoring rank of 3, meaning they don't score that much and they allow a lot of scoring, a passing rank of 30 and an allowed passing rank of 30, a rushing rank of 32, and an allowed rushing rank of 28. Just to note that, our total fantasy points, really the averages I think are what matters, so you have an average of 60 fantasy points per game for Pittsburgh, 48.5 for the Bengals, 79.9 for PPR averages, and 70.2 for the Bengals from PPR. Looking at our team averages, you get 206.6 average passing yards per game for the Steelers, 84 average rushing yards per game. They've given up 3 interceptions, and they suffer 1.8 sacks on average per game. The Bengals have an average of 194 passing yards per game, an average of just over 56 rushing yards per game. They've thrown 8 interceptions this season, averaging 1.3 interceptions per game, and an average of 2.6 sacks suffered per game. Interesting enough, this allowed bit is actually where all the allowed numbers came out, so it's odd that it's in here, but I'll have to clean that up because it's hard to know what's what now. I have tight end numbers too I want to put in here so you can kind of see the whole structure of stuff I was putting together, and they don't do the averages there. So I screwed that up. I'll have that fixed for the next games. I apologize for that. But I guess we can look at what we can, which is just our QB hits, averaging 10.6 for the Steelers per game, 4.3 for Cincinnati. The Steelers get an average of an interception per game, as do the Bengals. They both have a total. That gives them 5 for the Steelers since they've had their bye, 6 for the Bengals on the season. And the Steelers get an average of 4 sacks per game, where the Cincinnati gets an average of 1.8 sacks per game. Looking at the quarterbacks, you have Aaron Rodgers on Pittsburgh and Joe Flacco for the Bengals. Aaron Rodgers has 78 fantasy points this season for an average of 15.6. Joe Flacco has 44.7 for an average of 8.9. Rodgers has given up 3 interceptions this season with 9 sacks suffered. Flacco has given up 6 interceptions with 10 sacks suffered. And he also has lost 2 fumbles due to sacks. On average, Aaron Rodgers gets 204.2 passing yards per game and under 5 rushing yards per game, as does Joe Flacco with his rushing yards. And he gets 206.8 passing yards per game, also below that 210 passing yard mark, but over the 200s. His best week was week 1 with 290 passing yards, and his worst week in week 3 with 142 passing yards. For Aaron Rodgers, his best week was week 1 with 244 passing yards, and week 3 was his worst with 139 passing yards. For our running backs on Pittsburgh, you have Jalen Warren, and on the Bengals, you have Chase Brown. Warren has 39.7 fantasy points this season, 52.7 in PPR, for an average of 9.9 fantasy points, or 13.2 in PPR. Chase Brown has 38.4 fantasy points, 58.4 in PPR. That's an average of 6.4 fantasy points, or 9.3 in PPR. Neither running back has actually given up any turnovers. On average, Warren gets 46 rushing yards per game and 38.2 receiving yards per game, while Chase Brown gets an average of 33.6 rushing yards per game and an average of 17 receiving yards per game. Warren's best week was last week with 52 rushing yards, and his worst week was week 1 with 37 rushing yards. He hit an high of 86 receiving yards in week 2 and a low of 11 receiving yards last week. Chase Brown's best week was week 2 with 47 rushing yards, and his worst week was right after that with only 3 rushing yards. And his best week in receiving was 31 receiving yards in week 4. Looking at the receivers, you have DK Metcalf on Pittsburgh and Jamar Chase for the Bengals. Metcalf has 59.6 fantasy points this season, 78.6 in PPR. That's an average of 11.9 fantasy points, or 15.7 in PPR. Jamar Chase has 69.4 fantasy points. That's 111.4 in PPR, 11.5 average, or 18.5 in PPR. Looking at their averages, you get 71.2 average receiving yards for Metcalf, and from Jamar Chase, you get an average of 78 receiving yards per game. Metcalf's best week was in week 4 with 126 receiving yards. He also had a good last week with 95 receiving yards, and his worst weeks were 2 and 3 with 20 and 32 receiving yards. Jamar Chase's best week was week 2 with 165 receiving yards. He also had a good week 5 with 110 receiving yards. His worst weeks were 4 and 1 with 23 and 26 receiving yards. Despite that, as number 1 receivers and expected, both these guys get the top receiving yards on their teams, right around that 36% or 38% mark. Ending with the tight ends for Pittsburgh, you have Darnell Washington, and for the Bengals, you have Noah Fant. Darnell has 10.2 fantasy points this season, 16.2 in PPR. That's an average of 3.4 fantasy points, or 5.4 in PPR. Noah Fant has 14.7 fantasy points, 30.7 in PPR. That's an average of 3.6 or 7.7 in PPR. The only turnover between them two was from Noah Fant. On average, Darnell Washington gets 27.3 receiving yards per game, and Noah Fant's about the same with 26.7 receiving yards per game. Both these guys have had some missed weeks, so Darnell's best week was in last week with 62 receiving yards. Worst week was week 2 with 0 receiving yards, so this is week 4, this is week 6. For Noah Fant, you have a really consistent number with 26, 28, 26, and 27. So that's all I got for Thursday Night Football. I'm still in the middle of cleaning up some of those numbers, as you could see, so hopefully those will get a little better for the weekend games and show a little bit more details about where teams give up their points, like if it's 2 tight ends or, how to break down the passing numbers. That's kind of some of the goals. So look forward to that. Otherwise, I hope that this was still useful for you. If it was, please leave a like and subscribe. Leave a comment on what else you'd want to see or what else I need to add. And other than that, thank you so much for watching.